I have buried 3 men I called friends, and I never cried for a single one of them. I tell you that not to brag, but so you'll understand what kind of man I was before that summer. Hard, dry as the arroyo in August. The kind of man who could watch a thing die and think mostly about what the hide might fetch. So when I say that a barefoot rancher with dirt under his nails and holes worn through the brim of his hat made me weep like a boy at his own mother's grave, you'll know I don't say it to be pretty. There was a secret buried up on that mountain. A secret worth more than every dollar in the territory, and the whole valley walked past it for 11 years because it wore patched trousers and answered to the name of a poor man. Only one soul ever found it. She found it the same week the town threw her out like dishwater off a back porch. And what she did with it, Lord, what she did with it, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, with the shouting and the rain and a girl standing in a doorway that had just been slammed in her face by her own father. My name is Elias Crane, and in the spring of 1888 I was a cattle buyer working the high country between the Chiricahua foothills and the little scab of buildings that folks generously called the town of Redemption. I keep a log, always have. Weather, weights, prices, the mood of the men I trade with, the price of coffee beans and lamp oil and rope. My wife, God rest her, used to say I trusted the log more than I trusted people, and she wasn't wrong, and she's in the ground now. So I suppose the log won that argument the way the last one standing always wins. I mention the log because everything I'm about to tell you, I wrote down that same season, in pencil, by lamplight, in a boarding house room that smelled of tallow and old rain. I've read it back so many times the graphite's gone silver at the creases, and the pages have gone soft as cloth. This is not a story I remembered soft over the years and sanded smooth for the telling. This is a story I set down while it was still bleeding. You'll have to forgive me if some of it still stings on the way out. It stings on the way out for me too. The first time I laid eyes on Thomas Ballard, he was standing in a creek up to his knees in November cold, holding a newborn calf above the black water while its mother bawled from the bank. I'd come up the draw looking to buy the Hendricks herd and gotten myself turned around in a country that all looks the same in bad light. And there was this man, thin, dark-haired, sun-cracked at the temples though he couldn't have been 40, soaked to the middle of his chest, murmuring low and steady to a calf that wasn't even his own animal. It was a Hendricks calf, strayed off and gone into the water and would have drowned inside the hour. Thomas didn't know I was sitting my horse up on the rise, watching. He got the calf to the bank and set it down gentle as a mother lays a sleeping child, and only then, straightening up, did he notice that his own boots had floated off downstream while he worked. Both of them. Gone. And you know what he did? He laughed. Alone in the cold, knee-deep in a creek in his stocking feet at his own foolishness. That laugh told me more about the man than a year of conversation could have. It was the laugh of somebody who had lost so much bigger than a pair of boots, that a pair of boots could only strike him as funny. I didn't know it yet, but I just met the poorest rich man in the Arizona territory. I rode down and offered him my spare blanket, and he thanked me and asked, of all the things a man might ask a stranger, whether the sky had been clear the night before down in the valley. I said I supposed it had. He nodded like I'd given him something worth more than the blanket. I thought he was simple. That was my first mistake about Thomas Ballard, and it would not be my last. I saw him a handful of times over that winter and into the spring, mostly at a distance, the way you notice a hawk on the same fence post and stop remarking on it. Once, in the mercantile, I watched him count out coins for a half-pound of coffee and come up 2 cents short, and I watched him set the coffee back on the shelf without a word of complaint, as though 2 cents were simply a fact of the weather. And I watched Cornelius Vance behind the counter, let him do it, watched a man worth thousands stand there, and let a scholar count pennies and lose. I didn't know what Thomas was then. But even not knowing, something in the arithmetic of it sat wrong in my chest. The way a note played flat will sit wrong even in the ear of a man who can't read music. I'll tell you one more thing about Thomas Ballard before the trouble starts, because you ought to have it in hand. There was a boy in Redemption, the wheelwright's son, maybe 10 years old, who had a way of trailing after Thomas whenever the man came down off the mountain. The other children threw pebbles and called the poor man names their mothers had taught them. But this one boy followed at a distance with his hands in his pockets and his eyes up, because Thomas Ballard, it turned out, would answer any question a child asked him about the sky as though it were the most serious business in the world. Why does the moon come up fat one week and thin the next? Where do the falling stars land? Whether a man could ever get up there. And Thomas would stop and crouch down to the boy's height there in the muddy street and answer him true and full and patient, while the whole town walked past and pitied them both. I saw it twice. The second time, I confess, I had to look away. Everyone in Redemption called Thomas Ballard poor, and they called it the way you'd name a dog without thinking, as a permanent and settled fact of the world. Poor Thomas. His ranch sat high up the mountain, 40 acres of rock and scrub oak and wind that nobody had wanted when he took it and nobody envied after. His cabin leaned a little more each year, like a man getting tired. His fences sagged. He owned maybe a dozen head of cattle, thin ones, and a mule named Deacon, who was older than sin and twice as set in his ways. He wore the same 2 shirts turn and turn about, patched so many times the patches themselves wore patches, and in a valley where a man's whole worth got measured out in the cut of his coat, and the shine of his rig and the fatness of his horse, Thomas Ballard measured to just about nothing at all. Children were told to be grateful they hadn't been born to a life like his. Mothers pointed him out on the street as a plain warning of where laziness and pride would land a person. And he heard it. I know for a fact he heard it, because I once stood outside the mercantile and watched a merchant's wife take her boy by the collar and haul him bodily across the muddy street, just to keep him out of Thomas Ballard's passing shadow, as though poverty were a thing that rubbed off like coal dust. And I saw the muscle in Thomas's jaw move, just once, a small thing. Then he touched 2 fingers to the ruined brim of his hat and wished that woman a fine morning and meant it, or made it sound like he meant it, which up close is nearly the same act of grace. I want you to sit with that a moment before we go on. A man lifting his hat to the very woman teaching her son to despise him. I didn't understand it. I thought it was weakness. I thought poor Thomas had simply been ground down so long, and so fine that he'd forgotten a man was even allowed to be angry. It took me the whole of that summer, a girl's ruin, a night I still can't think about without my hands going to ice, and one long confession by lamplight, to understand that Thomas Ballard was not beaten at all. Thomas knew something the rest of us didn't know. He carried it the way you'd carry a live coal cupped in your bare palm, carefully, constantly, hour upon hour, without once letting the smoke of it show on your face. The whole town looked at that man and pitied him. It never once occurred to a single soul in Redemption that the pity might be running exactly backwards. Now the girl. Her name was Naomi Vance, and to understand what was done to her you first have to understand the Vances, and to understand the Vances you have to understand that in a town like Redemption, a whole family could be built out of appearances, top to bottom, and never once notice that the frame underneath had gone soft with rot. Cornelius Vance owned the mercantile and a share of the freight line, and a good third of the standing debt in the valley besides. He wore a gold watch chain thick as my thumb, and he prayed the loudest of any man at Sunday service, with his chin lifted so the back rows could admire his devotion. He had one daughter, Naomi, whom he intended to marry off to the Prout boy, Silas Prout, whose father owned the bank. It was to be the wedding of the season. The wedding of the decade, folks said. 2 fortunes stitched together at the altar, with a 19-year-old girl for the seam. Nobody asked the seam how it felt about the stitching. Nobody ever does. I met Naomi before I ever learned her name. I was in the mercantile that April buying nails and lamp oil, and there was a girl behind the counter, slight, with ink stains worked into the creases of her fingers and a habit of biting the inside of her cheek when she ran a long column of figures. She caught an error in my bill, in my favor. 11 cents her father would never have missed and I would never have known to look for. She pointed it out anyway, quiet, sliding the corrected slip across the counter without any fuss about it. Cost the Vance Mercantile 11 cents out loud on purpose. I remember thinking that one is honest to her own detriment. And in redemption, I'm sorry to tell you, that is not counted a virtue. That is a fault line. And fault lines, given enough weight standing on them, do what fault lines do. What I didn't know that April, what nobody in the whole valley knew except Naomi and one other person, was that she'd been climbing that mountain. Every Tuesday, when her father believed she was down at the church basement with the needlework circle, Naomi Vance saddled a borrowed mare and rode the switchbacks up to Thomas Ballard's leaning cabin. Not for romance. I need you to hear that clearly and hold on to it, because the whole town would soon reach for the ugliest possible thing. And the ugliest possible thing was so far from the truth it would have been laughable if it hadn't cost her everything. She went up that mountain because 8 months before she'd found a book. It came in a crate of donated goods bound for the mission, old water-stained volumes nobody wanted, the pages gone to mildew and mouse. Naomi, sorting them alone on a slow afternoon, had turned up a slim book on the movement of the stars. The kind of thing a girl in that valley was never once meant to want, let alone understand. And inside the front cover, written in a spidery, careful hand she'd found, property of T. Ballard. Return if found, though I confess I doubt it shall be. So she rode up the mountain to return it. That was the whole of her intent. A book. She figured to find a simple, grateful, maybe embarrassed man, hand back what was his, and ride down again having done a small kindness. What she found instead was Thomas Ballard at a workbench in that shabby leaning cabin, grinding a lens by hand, grinding glass, with jeweler's patience, by the light of a single window, surrounded by drawings so precise and so strange that she forgot entirely to hand back the book. She stood in the doorway a full minute. She told me later, before he even noticed her, and in that minute her whole map of the world quietly redrew itself. I'm going to tell you now the thing the town never learned, because otherwise you'll spend this whole story straining after the mystery, and I'd rather you spend it straining after the people. Thomas Ballard had been, before ever he came to redemption, an assistant to an astronomer at a great observatory back east. He had a mind that could hold the whole clockwork of the heavens inside it and turn it over slow, like a man turning a watch to see how it's made. He had published under his own name, in journals whose very titles the men of that valley could not have read to you if you'd held a pistol to their ear, calculations that helped predict the return of a comet to a matter of days. And then something had happened, a falling out, work of his, years of it, taken up and printed under a wealthier man's name, with Thomas's own careful hand rubbed out of the record like a smudge off a slate. A ruin so complete and so quiet and so entirely legal that Thomas had done the only thing that made any sense to a soul built the way his was built. He had walked west until the talking stopped. He had bought the worst 40 acres in the territory precisely because no living person would ever bother to come and look at them. And he had gone on doing the work, alone, on a mountain, grinding his own lenses because he could no longer afford to buy them, because he would sooner be thought a pauper who could see the rings of Saturn with his own hand-cut glass than a gentleman who, with all the money in the world, could no longer see anything at all. That was the secret. Not gold, not a hidden claim, not silver in the rock, not a strongbox under the floor. A man of rare and genuine brilliance, hiding in plain sight as the valley's favorite failure, because he had learned the hard and expensive way that the world will take brilliance out of the hands of a poor man and set a rich man's name on it before the ink is even dry. And Naomi Vance had stumbled onto it for one simple reason. In 11 years, she was the only person who had ever climbed that mountain to give something back instead of to take something away. Now the rain, the doorway, let me bring you at last to the night the whole thing came apart at the seam. It was late June, 3 weeks shy of the wedding, and the town of Redemption was drunk on its own anticipation. The flowers ordered, the cake spoken for, the Prout and Vance names already being spoken in the same breath as though the merger were done. And into all that warm certainty, Like a stone heaved through a church window during the hymn, came the rumor. I don't know for a fact who started it. I have my strong suspicions, and they wear a gold watch chain, and I'll say no more than that, because I'll not hang a charge on a dead man that I couldn't have proved while he lived. The rumor itself was simple, and it was filthy. That Naomi Vance had been seen, week upon week, month upon month, riding up alone to the poor man's cabin, that she'd been slipping away in secret for the better part of a year. The rumor did not say astronomy. Rumors never do. Rumors reach for the mud every single time, because mud is what people have already half decided to believe about any 19-year-old girl who carries herself as though she thinks she might be worth more than her station allows. Silas Prout called off the wedding in the middle of the mercantile, in front of 6 paying customers, at the very top of his lungs. I was standing right there. I had come in for coffee beans, and I got instead a front row seat to the public execution of a girl's whole life. Silas took the ring, a real ring, gold, the kind of ring a banker's son buys chiefly to be seen buying it, and he threw it down onto the floorboards at her feet, and he told her, loud enough for the street to hear through the open door, that he would not marry a woman who'd been up a mountain alone with a beggar. And Cornelius Vance, her own father, her own blood, do you know what that man did? He did not defend her. He did not so much as put his body between his daughter and the words. He looked at his ruined merger, his 2 great fortunes coming apart right at the seam that was his only child, and he made his choice as quick and cold as a man choosing which lame horse to shoot. He turned to Naomi and he told her, in front of the 6 customers and the open door, to explain herself this instant or get out of his house and his sight for good. And here is the moment I will carry with me into the ground. Naomi could have explained. She had the truth in her hands the whole time, clean and simple and entirely to her credit. She could have said, I ride up there to learn the stars. He is not a beggar, father, he is a scholar, greater than any man you have ever shaken hands with, and if you rode up that mountain yourself you'd feel like a fool for a solid year afterward. She could have said every word of it. It was true. And the truth, spoken plain in that room, would have saved her on the spot. But saving herself would have exposed him. If she told them what waited up that mountain, the lenses, the drawings, the mind that had numbered a comet, then the whole valley would climb it inside a week, and the men with gold watch chains and folded banknotes would find a way. They always found a way. It was the one thing those men were truly gifted at. They would find a way to take what Thomas Ballard had built with his ruined, patient, glass-cut hands, and to set a richer man's name on it, and to do it all so smoothly and so lawfully that Thomas would be left standing exactly where he'd started, only with the last thing he owned taken from him too. Again. It would happen to him again. And this time it would happen because a girl he'd been kind to had opened her mouth to save her own skin. She had heard him tell that whole story once, on a cold Tuesday, his voice gone flat, and even as a frozen pond, while his hands never stopped moving on the lens. And she had understood it the way only a person standing at the very edge of losing everything can truly understand another person who has already lost it all and lived. So Naomi Vance stood in her father's mercantile, with the gold ring winking up at her from the floorboards and the whole town's eyes fixed on her like crows on a wire, and she made her choice. She said nothing. She let them believe the mud. She spent her own good name, every last coin of it, to buy silence over a poor man's secret. And she walked out into the rain having traded the entire remainder of her future for a quiet that not one person in that room would ever think to thank her for. I followed her out. I still can't fully tell you why. I'm not a kind man. I've been honest with you about that from the start. But I'd seen the ledger error back in April. I'd seen the 11 honest cents slid across the counter. And something in me, some old rusted-over part I'd have sworn had seized up for good, could not stand to watch that girl walk out into a storm alone with every soul behind her certain they knew exactly what she was. I caught up to her under the awning of the feed store, where the rain came off the eaves in a solid gray rope. She was soaked through already, shaking, her jaw set in that exact way I'd watched Thomas set his outside the mercantile, the small muscle working once, twice, holding the line against the wanting to break down. I asked her. I don't know that I had the right, but I asked her anyway, quiet, just the two of us under that dripping tin. I asked her whether it was true, what they'd said in there. She looked at me, rain running clean off the ruined brim of her bonnet and down her face, so I couldn't have told you, honestly, which of it was rain. And she said the thing I wrote down in my log that same night and have never once been able to scratch back out. She said, "It's true that I went up the mountain. Everything else they can keep." And then she stepped off the boards and walked out into the full weight of the storm, toward the livery, toward the only road that led up and out of a town that had just finished deciding she was worth nothing at all, and toward the one man in that whole valley who knew, down to the penny, exactly what it cost a soul to be called poor by people far too small to understand what they were even looking at. I stood under that awning a long while after she'd gone, long enough that the coffee beans in my coat pocket went soft and useless with the damp. I was 46 years old that summer, and I had just watched a girl do the bravest, most foolish, most flatly self-destroying thing I had ever seen a human being do with their own two hands, and I could not for the life of me decide whether I'd witnessed a saint or a girl clean out of her senses. That was the whole trouble with that summer, and I may as well warn you of it now, at the start. Every single time I thought I'd finally gotten a person figured, Thomas, Naomi, Cornelius, my own hard self, they'd go and do a thing that knocked the understanding right out of my hands and into the mud. And I'd have to bend down and pick it up and start the whole reckoning over again from the beginning. I thought about the 11 cents the whole ride back to the boarding house. It kept coming to me sideways, the way a small thing will when a large thing is too big to look at square. A girl who would cost her own father 11 cents to be honest, keeping silent while the same town called her a liar and worse. There's a kind of person who tells small truths and small lies as convenience serves them. And then there's the rarer, more dangerous kind who has decided somewhere deep down that the truth is a debt owed, and pays it every time, and pays it even when the collector is cruelty itself. I had not met many of the second kind. I have met fewer since. I did not yet know that I'd just spoken to two of them in the same day, the girl under the awning, and the man waiting at the top of the mountain for her to come pounding on his door. I went back to my log that night in the boarding house, with the storm walking slow and heavy across the roof shingles overhead. I wrote the date. I wrote the weather. I wrote the price of coffee beans, out of pure long habit, the way a drowning man will still reach for the rail he's used to. And then I stopped, and I sat there a good while with the pencil not moving at all. Because for the first time in 20 years of keeping that log, I had witnessed a thing that no column of figures anywhere could hold or carry. I wrote one line at last underneath the weather. I wrote, "The poor man on the mountain is not poor, and the town has just thrown away the only person alive who knew it. God help her, riding up there tonight in this. God help all the rest of us who stood in that store and watched and said not one word." Then I underlined the word nothing. I'd written, said nothing first and struck it for said not one word. But I underlined the first one anyway. I underlined it so hard the pencil point tore clean through the page and left a mark on the sheet beneath. It's still there. I looked at it again just the other night. 20 years on and the tear is still there, like the paper itself couldn't quite hold what I was asking it to. What I did not know, sitting in that damp little room with the lamp guttering and the rain coming down like the sky had a grievance, was that Naomi's ride up the mountain that night would not be the end of her ruin. It would be the beginning of something the town of Redemption was in no way, shape, or form prepared for, because a secret shared between two ruined people is not a small and quiet thing that stays where you put it. It is a fuse, and Naomi Vance had just set it alight with her own name for the match. But that is the second part of this story, and I mean to tell it to you right or not at all. To tell it right, I have to tell you what Thomas Ballard said when a soaked, disgraced, half-frozen girl pounded on his leaning door at 2 in the morning and told him, through her chattering teeth, that she had thrown her entire life clean away to keep his secret safe. I have to tell you what he did. And what he did was not, in any way, the thing you would expect from a grateful man. It was not gratitude at all. It was something harder than that and stranger, and in the long run worth a great deal more than any thanks he could have given her. He was angry. Thomas Ballard, the gentlest man I ever knew, opened his door to the girl who'd sacrificed everything to protect him, and he was angry at her. And by the time you understand exactly why, you'll understand every last thing I first climbed that mountain not knowing. She pounded on Thomas Ballard's door at 2 in the morning, soaked to the bone, having ridden a borrowed mare up switchbacks in the black rain that would have killed a lesser rider or a lesser horse. When he opened it, lamp in one hand, the other shielding the flame, she got out perhaps 4 words. She got out that she'd been thrown over and that she hadn't told them, and then her legs went and the crying came all at once, the way a dam goes. Not slow, but all in the same instant, everything at once. Thomas got her inside and got the door shut against the wind. He wrapped her in a blanket that was more patch than blanket. He built the fire up. And then she told me this part looking at the floor, as though even weeks later she wasn't sure she'd earned the memory. Then he crouched down in front of her and he looked at her a long moment, and instead of thanking her, instead of any soft word at all, he said, low and hard, "Why would you do a fool thing like that? Why would you throw yourself on the fire for a stack of drawings and a broken old man's pride?" She said she'd stared at him. She'd ridden up a mountain in a killing storm expecting she didn't know what. Gratitude, maybe. Someone to be glad she existed, on the one night the whole world had decided she was worthless. And instead here was the man she'd sacrificed everything for, crouched in the firelight, plainly furious, his voice shaking. And she said it was the first thing all night that had made her feel like a person again instead of a scandal, because he wasn't angry that she'd come. He was angry, she understood slowly, that she had spent herself, that she had looked at his life, a life the whole valley had already written off as worthless, and decided it was worth more than her own future, and that arithmetic offended him to the center of his soul. They argued. Can you feature it? 2 in the morning, the storm trying to take the roof, a girl in ruins and a pauper who wasn't one, and they sat there and argued like 2 scholars over a proof. He told her she should have spoken. She told him she'd sooner have died. He told her that was exactly the trouble. That she'd decided a thing about the value of his work and his person without asking his leave, and that in doing so she'd made herself as bad as the men who'd once decided the opposite about him, that his work and his person were worth nothing, because both were the same crime, deciding a man's worth for him, setting a price on a soul that isn't yours to price. That stopped her. She told me it stopped her cold, because she saw at once that he was right, and that she was, and that both those things could stand in the same room together without canceling out. She had done a beautiful thing, and she had done it by robbing herself, and he could not accept the beautiful thing while the robbery was still going on. And she said, and this is the part I've turned over most of all, she said that in 20 minutes of being properly, furiously argued with by a man in a patched shirt, she felt more respected than she had in 19 years of being agreed with by everyone who wanted something from her. It was later that same night, the fire down to coals, that Thomas told her the whole of his own ruin, not the version I gave you earlier, which I assembled from pieces, but the real one, told plain by the man it happened to. He told her about the observatory, and the older astronomer he'd trusted like a father, and the years of his own calculations that had gone into the great work. And he told her about the morning he'd opened the journal, the printed and bound and celebrated journal, and found the work there under the other man's name with his own scrubbed clean away, and how when he'd protested he'd been called ungrateful, unstable, a difficult young man overreaching his station, until the very people who'd known the truth found it easier to disbelieve him than to cross a powerful man. He'd had no gold watch chain of his own to fight back with. He'd had only the truth, and he'd learned, at a cost that had emptied him out entirely, that the truth without power behind it is a thing men can simply agree not to see. That is why I did not want you to spend yourself for me, he told her, and Naomi said his voice, for the only time she ever heard it, was not flat at all, because I know exactly what it is to give everything you have to something true and watch the world decide it is worth nothing. I have been where you are going. I would not send anyone there, least of all the one person in 11 years who bothered to climb the hill." And Naomi said she understood then that his anger had never been anger at all. It had been fear, the particular, helpless fear of a man watching someone he'd come to care for walk cheerfully toward the exact cliff he himself had gone over. He was not ungrateful for her sacrifice. He was terrified of it, because he loved her, not the way the town would have leered to imagine, but the way a teacher loves the one student who might carry the work past his own failing hands, and he could not bear to watch the world do to her what it had done to him. When the fire had burned down some and the worst of the storm had passed on over the ridge, Thomas made her an offer. It was not a soft offer, and it did not come wrapped in comfort. He said, "You cannot go back down, and you will not stay up here as anyone's ruin or anyone's rescue, so we will make it a wage." He said he had need of hands he could trust, someone to keep the records, someone to grind the coarse work on the lenses so his own hands, which were beginning to shake worse each winter, could be saved for the fine work, someone who could do the arithmetic he was too tired to do twice. He said he could pay almost nothing. He said she would learn a great deal and be respected by no one and eat plain and work hard. He said it as though he were warning her off, and Naomi understood that this was, from Thomas Ballard, the most generous thing he knew how to offer another human being. Honest work, an honest wage, and the honest truth about both. She took it. Of course she took it. Where else on God's earth was there for her to go? But she told me, and I believed her, because I'd come to know them both by then. She told me she'd have taken it even with a door open behind her back to her old life. Because for the first time she'd been offered a thing on the level. Not a marriage that was really a merger. Not a father's approval that was really a leash. A job and the truth, and a man who was angry at her precisely because he refused to let her sell herself cheap. She said she slept that first night on a pallet by the banked fire, in a stranger's cabin, disgraced, penniless, employed at almost nothing, and she slept better than she had in a year. The first weeks were not gentle, and Naomi never pretended otherwise to me. Grinding a lens is slow, exacting, ruinous work. You push glass against glass with an abrasive between them, hour upon hour, checking the curve against a template by candlelight, and one moment's carelessness undoes a week's progress. She wept over it more than once. She admitted, out of pure frustration, and Thomas would not comfort her when she did. He'd just say, "Again," the way he'd said it that first night, and set her back to it. She hated him for it a little in those first weeks. And then she noticed her hands had stopped shaking at the fine work while his had only gotten worse, and she understood that he'd been teaching her to be the hands he was losing, and that there was more tenderness in that, again, than in any comfort he could have offered. He was not making her useful to him. He was making her irreplaceable. There is a difference, and Naomi Vance, who had spent 19 years being made merely useful, felt the difference in her bones. And she learned. Lord, how she learned. The girl who'd caught 11 cents in a grocer's ledger turned out to have a mind that took to the mathematics of the heavens the way dry ground takes water, greedily, completely, with a kind of shocked gratitude. Within a month she was catching Thomas's errors, small ones, the way she'd once caught mine. Within 2 she was proposing corrections he hadn't seen. He told me, privately, the one time I ever heard him boast of anything, that in 30 years of the work he had met perhaps 4 minds with that particular gift, and that 3 of them had been at the great observatory back east, and the 4th was grinding glass on his porch in a grocer's cast-off apron, because the world had decided she was a scandal. He said it, and then he looked away, out at the dark, and I understood he was thinking of everything the world throws away without ever knowing what it had. I learned all of this in pieces over the weeks that followed because I did not myself ride up the mountain until nearly the end of July, and I want to be honest with you about why. I told myself it was business. I had a herd to move, buyers to answer to, no cause to go poking up a scandal's switchbacks. But the truth, The 11-cent truth I owed the story is that I was a coward about it. I had stood in that mercantile and said nothing, exactly as everyone else had said nothing, and a part of me did not want to look Naomi Vance in the eye, because to look at her was to be reminded that when the moment came to speak, I had studied my coffee beans instead. Shame is a strange engine. It'll keep a grown man off a mountain for a month. What finally drove me up there was the town itself, because Redemption, having thrown Naomi out, did not have the decency to then forget about her. Small towns never do. They worry a ruin like a dog worries a bone, long past any meat being left on it. And by mid-July a new story had started down in the valley, uglier than the first, and this one I could not walk past. The story was that Naomi Vance was living up the mountain with the poor man now living in sin, the church ladies said, though they used the plain word when the men weren't listening, and that Thomas Ballard had lured a respectable girl to her ruin with some kind of low mountain sorcery. That last part would be funny if it hadn't caught. But it caught. It caught because it let the town off the hook. If Thomas was a villain, then throwing Naomi out was justice, and nobody in that mercantile had done a shameful thing at all. You see how it works. The lie does chores for the people who repeat it. So I rode up. Last week of July, a hot, dry morning, the kind where the whole country smells of resin and dust. I told myself I was going to warn Thomas that the town's mood was turning past gossip toward something meaner, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole of it. I wanted to see. I wanted to see with my own eyes whether the thing I'd half understood in the rain 3 weeks before was real. It was real. I came up over the last switchback and there was the leaning cabin, and there was Naomi Vance in a work apron with her sleeves rolled, grinding glass at a bench set up in the shade of the porch, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, ink on her fingers same as ever but sawdust and rouge powder there now too. And there was Thomas at a second bench, and the two of them were arguing cheerfully this time, the way people argue who have decided the argument itself is a kind of friendship over some figure in a ledger between them. She looked up and saw me, and I braced for the reproach I'd earned. It didn't come. She just wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Mr. Crane, you're just in time to settle it. Thomas has the drift of a star wrong by half a degree and he won't hear it from me." And Thomas said, without looking up, "She's the one who's wrong and she knows it, and she's hopping you don't know enough to catch her out." And I stood there on that mountain, hat in my hands, and I nearly wept, because I did not know enough to catch either of them out, and they had just, both of them in the space of 2 sentences, forgiven me for a silence I hadn't even confessed. That night Thomas showed me the thing he'd built. I'd best not pretend I understood the half of it. He had, over 11 years, on the worst 40 acres in the territory, using glass he ground by hand and a frame he'd built from a wagon axle and salvaged brass, constructed a telescope. Not a toy, not a spyglass. A true instrument, the equal, he said this flatly, without pride, the way he said everything, the equal of things he'd worked with back east in buildings that cost more than the whole town of Redemption. And he set my eye to it, and he pointed it at a smudge of light I'd have called nothing my whole life, and I saw a ring around a world. Saturn hanging out there in the black, sharp and small and impossible and absolutely real, and I made a sound I'm not proud of, and Thomas said, "Quiet." Yes. That's the sound. Everyone makes that sound. And I understood then why a man might give up everything and live on rock and scrub to keep his eye at that glass. Some things, once you've seen them, unfit you for the pettier business of the valley below. But here is the thing that turned it from a marvel into a story, because a marvel is just a marvel. What Thomas showed me next was a ledger, Naomi's ledger in her careful figuring hand, and it was a record of measurements. Months of them, years of his and now months of theirs together. And Thomas explained in that flat voice that he had been tracking something, a returning thing, a comet, the same class of object as the one whose numbers had been stolen from him a decade before. Only this one nobody back east knew was coming, because the only man who'd done the arithmetic to see it was hiding on a mountain in Arizona, thought dead or forgotten by the few who'd ever known his name. He had found it alone, and now he and a disgraced grocer's daughter were confirming it together, night after night, in a leaning cabin, on a wage of almost nothing. "When it comes," Naomi said, and she said it looking at Thomas, not at me, "when it comes and it's where his numbers say it will be to the day, then the record will show who saw it first. Not a rich man, not a stolen name, him, in his own hand and mine as witness." And I understood at last and all at once what the fuse was that she'd lit with her own name back in that mercantile. She had not sacrificed her future for a stack of drawings and an old man's pride, whatever Thomas had accused her of in the fury of that first night. She had sacrificed it to buy him time. Time and quiet and secrecy up on that mountain, so that when the sky finally proved him right in front of the whole world, no man with a gold watch chain could get there first to steal it. Again. It was the bravest bet I ever saw a person make. She had wagered her entire good name, her marriage, her father, her whole place in the only world she'd ever known, wagered all of it on a smudge of light that might or might not return on a date scratched in a ledger by a man everyone she'd ever met considered a failure. If Thomas was wrong, if the comet didn't come, she'd have ruined herself for nothing, for a madman's arithmetic, and she'd have proved the whole town right about them both. And she knew it. That was what undid me. She sat there in the lamplight and she knew exactly how the bet could go, and she'd made it anyway with her eyes open, because she had done the one thing the whole valley was incapable of doing. She had climbed the mountain and looked through the glass and decided a man's worth for herself, firsthand, instead of taking the town's word for it. I stayed on that mountain 2 full days that first visit, and they changed me, and I'm not too proud to say it. I had come up a cattle buyer who trusted a ledger of prices more than any living soul, and I found up there 2 people keeping a different kind of ledger entirely, a ledger of the sky, kept honest for no profit and no audience but the truth itself. On the second night Naomi let me look through the glass again, and she stood beside me nomming the things I was seeing, patient with my ignorance the way Thomas had been patient with the wheelwright's boy, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt since before I put my wife in the ground. I felt small in the good way, the way that makes a man's own grudges and calculations seem like what they are, which is very little, held up against a ring of ice around a distant world. I rode down changed. Not fixed, a man of 46 doesn't get fixed, but turned, the way a compass turns when you finally take the iron out of your pocket. I rode down the next morning carrying that secret, and I'll tell you plainly it was a heavier load than any cattle I ever moved, because the town was not going to leave them be. I could feel it turning, down in the valley, the mood going from gossip to grievance the way a summer sky goes from bright to green before the hail. Cornelius Vance had begun to talk about his daughter as a woman deceived, a victim of the mountain sorcerer, and I understood the ugly cleverness of it. A deceived daughter can be forgiven and taken back and remarried to advantage, but only if the deceiver is punished first. Only if Thomas Ballard is driven off his mountain or worse, so that Cornelius's version of the story, the one where he is a wronged father and not a man who sold his own child for a bank merger, becomes the only version left standing. And the Pruitts, the banking family, they had their own reason to want Thomas gone that I didn't understand until later, and it was the simplest reason of all. Because those 40 acres of worthless rock and scrub sat directly across the only sensible route for a spur line the railroad was rumored to be pushing through. Worthless land has a way of becoming precious the moment a man with money needs it. And a poor lunatic squatting on it with no friends and no standing and a ruined girl for his only witness is the easiest kind of man in the world to remove. You just have to get the town to agree he's a villain first. And the town, God forgive it, was more than halfway there. I saw how far it had gone the first Sunday in August. I was in the mercantile. I couldn't seem to stay out of that store. It was where the valley's poison always surfaced first. And the wheelwright's boy was there, the one who used to trail Thomas asking about the moon. And I heard his father, the wheelwright, take the boy hard by the arm and tell him that if he ever caught him going up that mountain, or so much as speaking to the sorcerer again, he'd tan him past sitting for a week. And the boy, this is the part I set down that night with an unsteady hand. The boy looked up at his father and said, clear as a bell in that quiet store, "But Pa, he's the only one who ever answered me." And the whole store went still. And the wheelwright, shamed in front of his neighbors by a truth out of his own child's mouth, did what shamed men do. He struck the boy across the face and dragged him out, and behind them the store slowly filled back up with its comfortable murmur, everyone agreeing without a word that the boy had been the one in the wrong. I have thought about that boy many times over 20 years. He'd have been near 30 when the century turned. I hope to God he kept looking up. Because that was the whole disease of that valley, laid bare in one child's sentence. He's the only one who ever answered me. A town had a man in its midst who would kneel in the mud to tell a small boy the truth about the stars, and the town had decided, out of fear and envy and the sheer convenience of the lie, to call that man a devil. And it was going to cost them. Not in the way they feared. Thomas had no sorcery, no curse to lay on them. It was going to cost them the way real things always cost. Quietly, permanently, in the ledger of what they might have been and chose instead to burn. I have to stop here because what happened next happened fast, and I want to slow down and tell it right, the way it deserves. But I'll leave you where the story left me that hot July, riding down a mountain with a secret worth more than the whole valley in my chest, and a cold certainty in my gut that the two people I'd left up there, arguing happily over half a degree of arc, did not have as much time as they thought. The comet was coming. Thomas's numbers said so. But the mob was coming faster, and between those two arrivals, the one written in the sky and the one gathering in the valley, sat one leaning cabin, one hand-ground lens, one old scholar with shaking hands, and one girl who had already proven she would burn her whole life to the ground, rather than let a small and frightened world put its cheap price on something precious. What happened when those two arrivals met, the comet and the mob, the sky's verdict and the valleys, is the last part of this story. It is the part I have never once been able to read back in my log without setting the book down and sitting a while in the quiet. It cost more than any of us guessed, and it saved more than any of us dared hope. But not, I have to warn you, in the way you're expecting. Nothing that summer ever went the way anyone was expecting. That was the one dependable thing about it. Two things were coming toward that mountain, and I've spent 20 years grateful I was there to see which one arrived first. One was written in the sky in a language only two people in the whole territory could read. The other was gathering in the valley below, in the back rooms of the bank and the aisles of the mercantile, in the low talk of men who decided that 40 acres of rock had gotten too valuable to leave in a lunatic's hands. The comet and the mob. The sky's verdict and the valleys. This is the part where they met. Thomas's numbers said the comet would be visible, low in the northeast before dawn, on the 9th night of September. He'd staked everything on that date, his whole vindication, the proof in his own hand that would show the world he'd seen it first. Naomi had checked the arithmetic herself 3 separate times and could find no error, and by then I trusted her arithmetic more than I trusted the sunrise. So the 9th of September was the day the sky would settle accounts. The trouble was that the valley had picked its own date, and I found out about it barely in time. On the 6th of September I was down in Redemption settling a cattle contract, and I heard 2 of the Prute men talking outside the bank, not troubling to keep their voices down, because who was there to hear that mattered? And what they said, plain as anything, was that come the harvest gathering on the 8th, a big night, the whole valley in town, drink flowing, tempers loose, there would be a party of men riding up the mountain to put an end to the sorcerer and his witch. Drive them off was the polite way they said it. But I had lived long enough in that country to know what a party of drunk men with a grievance and a torch means when they ride up to a leaning cabin that nobody in town will miss. Drive them off. I knew better. So did they. The 8th, they meant to come on the 8th, and the comet would rise on the 9th. Do you see the cruelty of it, the razor's edge cruelty? If the mob came one night before the sky spoke, then Thomas Ballard would die a poor lunatic sorcerer, driven off or worse, and his life's work would burn in that cabin with him, and the comet would rise the very next dawn over the ashes with no one left to have predicted it, No ledger, no proof, nothing, and some man back east would find it a month later and give it his own name and never know he was standing on a grave. One night. The whole meaning of a man's life came down to the gap of a single night. I did not sleep. I rode up the mountain that same evening, the 6th, harder than I'd ever pushed a horse, and I told them everything. And here is where I learned the last thing I had left to learn about the two of them, and it was this. Neither one of them flinched at the danger to their own lives. Not for a second. What Naomi said, the first thing out of her before her own safety, before anything, was, the instruments, the ledgers. If they burn the cabin, we lose the proof even if the comet comes. And Thomas, quiet, already moving to the shelves. Then we move the proof off the mountain tonight. Everything that matters. Elias, can your wagon reach the North Draw? Not a word about themselves. Only the work. Only the truth that had to survive them. We worked through 2 nights. The instrument was too big and too fragile to move whole, so Thomas did a thing I will never forget. He took his own telescope apart. The work of 11 years, the hand-ground glass, the salvaged brass, the thing that had shown me the ring around a world. He broke it down into pieces with his own shaking hands, wrapping each lens in cloth, because a man cannot carry a whole telescope down a mountain in the dark, but he can carry its heart. And I watched his face while he did it, and it was steady, and I understood that he had made his peace long ago with the difference between the instrument and the work. The instrument was glass and brass. The work was the truth it had found, and the truth would fit in a saddlebag and a ledger, and that was what he saved. There is a particular quiet that settles over people doing careful work against a deadline they might not beat. We didn't talk much those 2 nights. Naomi packed the ledgers in oilcloth against the weather, 3 copies of the master record, checking each page against the others by lamplight so that no single fire or fall or lost bag could erase the whole. Thomas wrapped glass. I hauled and hitched and scouted the draw. And in the small hours of the second night, resting a moment on the porch step with the whole black bowl of stars turning overhead, Naomi said a thing to me quiet that I've kept. She said she wasn't afraid of the men. She said the only thing that frightened her was the idea of the comet rising over an empty mountain, arriving right on time to prove a good man right, with no one there to see it and write it down. A truth nobody witnesses, she said. Is that any different from a lie? He spent his whole life on the difference. I won't let it come down to no one being here. Then she went back inside to check the ledgers a 4th time. That was the whole of her, right there in the dark on the step. She'd made her decision to stay before she ever said it out loud. The rest was just packing. But here was the terrible arithmetic, and Thomas laid it out for us cold on the 2nd night. If they all 3 came down off the mountain to safety, and the cabin sat dark and empty when the mob arrived on the 8th, the men would find the instruments gone and know they'd been warned, and they would simply wait and come again. And there would be no proving anything on the 9th because no one would be at the glass to see the comet rise and record it. The proof of the sky needs a witness on the mountain at the exact hour. Someone had to be up there at dawn on the 9th, at the reassembled glass, the night after the mob came, to make the observation and sign the record. And the only way to be up there on the 9th was to be up there on the 8th. When the men came, someone had to stay. They fought about it. Of course they fought about it. It was the same fight as that first stormy night, only now the stakes were plain and mortal. Thomas said he would stay. It was his work, his risk, his life already 3/4 spent. Naomi said no, that his hands could no longer manage the fine adjustment of the instrument at speed and hers could, that if only one person could be at the glass at dawn on the 9th, it had to be the one whose hands still worked, and that person was her. And Thomas said he could not watch her burn for his work, that this was the very thing he'd forbidden from the start. And Naomi looked at him. I was standing right there. I'll carry it always. Naomi looked at him and said, "You told me the crime was deciding another person's worth for them, setting a price on a soul that isn't yours to price. Well, you don't get to price mine either, Thomas. This is my work now too. I earned it grinding your glass with my own hands. And I am telling you what it's worth to me." And she stayed. He couldn't argue with it. That was the terrible beauty of the thing. He had spent all summer teaching her that her worth was hers to reckon, that no one, not her father, not the town, not even him, had the right to price her soul or spend her sacrifice for her. And she had learned it. She had learned it so completely that she was now using it to walk toward a mob for the sake of a truth in the sky. He had made her free. And the first thing she did with her freedom was choose the one thing he most wanted to forbid. There is no answer to that. There was nothing he could say. He got the rest of the instruments and the master ledger down to my wagon in the north draw, and he did it weeping openly, an old man carrying the pieces of his life's work down a mountain in the dark, while the girl who'd saved it stayed behind at the top to hold the ground. I was with Thomas in the north draw when we saw the torches. The 8th of September, full dark, and a line of lights came up the switchbacks like a wound opening in the side of the mountain. I had to hold him. God forgive me, I had to physically hold that man to keep him from running back up, because he'd have run straight into it, and it would have accomplished nothing but 2 deaths instead of the one he feared. So we crouched in the draw with the wagon full of the last true instruments in the territory, and we watched the torches reach the cabin, and we waited for it to burn. I have never known a longer hour. Thomas had gone rigid against my arm and stopped fighting me, which was worse than the fighting because it meant he'd started praying, and I'd never once heard him pray. The torches clustered at the cabin. We could hear it faintly, a mile off in the still night, men's voices, rising and overlapping, the ugly music a crowd makes. And then a single voice under it, steady, that we both knew. Her voice. We couldn't make out the words. We could only tell that she was talking and that she hadn't stopped, and that as long as she was talking the cabin was not burning. Thomas whispered, so low I barely caught it, "What is she doing? What in God's name is she doing?" And I didn't know. I only knew that the torches weren't moving, weren't spreading, weren't becoming the thing we'd braced for. She was holding them with nothing but words and a lamp, and whatever it was in her that had walked out of a mercantile in the rain 3 months before rather than sell a good man cheap. I have thought since that I was watching the bravest thing I'll ever witness, and I couldn't even see it. I could only hear that it was still going on. It did not burn. I have to tell you what happened up there, though I didn't learn the whole of it until after, from Naomi and from 2 of the men themselves, years later, when shame had loosened their tongues. The men reached the cabin drunk and loud and ready for a sorcerer, and what they found was a 19-year-old girl, a girl half of them had known since she was a child behind her father's counter, standing in the doorway of a leaning cabin with a lamp in her hand and no fear in her face that anyone could see. And she did not beg. She did not run. She invited them in. She said, calm as still water, that there was no sorcery on that mountain. There was only a glass and a ledger, and that any man who cared to could look through the one and read the other and see for himself what she and Thomas Ballard had been doing up there. And then she offered to show them the sky. Now a mob is a fragile thing. People forget that. A mob is a spell, and a spell can break. Most of those men had come up expecting to be met with either a monster or a victim, and either one would have let them do what they'd come to do. What they were not prepared for, what no drunk righteous crowd is ever prepared for, was to be met with hospitality and truth and a girl offering to teach them something. It confused them. It slowed them. And a few of them, not all but a few, and a few was enough, a few actually looked. She pointed that spare glass she'd kept assembled at the rings of Saturn, and one after another, hard men who'd ridden up a mountain to burn her out put their eyes to the eyepiece and made the sound. You know the sound. Everyone makes the sound. And you cannot burn down a cabin 10 minutes after the thing inside it has shown you the rings of a distant world with your own eye. Some of them could have. Men are capable of anything, but that night those men couldn't. It wasn't clean. I want to be honest. Cornelius Vance was up there, and he did not look through any glass. He stood in the yard and demanded his deceived daughter come down off the mountain and be forgiven and made respectable again. And Naomi refused him in front of everyone, gently and completely, and something in the man broke that I don't think ever mended. And 2 of the Prout men, the ones who understood exactly what those 40 acres were worth to the railroad, they were furious that the spell had broken, and they made threats about the law and the deed and coming back with papers instead of torches. Which they did later. That fight wasn't over, but the fire didn't come that night. The girl in the doorway turned a mob into a scatter of confused and half-ashamed men who rode back down the mountain in ones and twos, and the cabin stood, and the ledger was safe, and the dawn of the 9th came on cold and clear. Naomi told me the rest of it later, the part with her father, and she told it without triumph, which is how I knew it had cost her. Cornelius had come up expecting to collect a repentant daughter. He'd built the whole story that way in his head: the sorcerer punished, the deceived girl reclaimed, his own conscience laundered clean. And when she stood in the doorway and would not play the part, when she told him plainly that she had not been deceived, that she had chosen this, that she was not sorry and would not pretend to be, he did not know what to do with her. He'd have known what to do with a rebel or a ruined girl. He did not know what to do with a woman who had simply, calmly, priced her own soul and found his offer too cheap. He called her ungrateful. He called her lost. And she told me she said it not to wound him, but because it was the last true thing she had to give him. She said, "You taught me to keep a ledger honest, Father. You just never expected me to keep the biggest one that way." Then she went back inside to the men who wanted to see Saturn. And Cornelius Vance stood alone in the yard of a cabin he tried to burn. And after a while he rode down, and he and his daughter never spoke again. There's the cost. I promised you there'd be a cost. Being right and being free does not come without one. It never has. And the comet rose, low in the northeast, just where the numbers said to the day, to the hour. Thomas and I came up out of the north draw in the last dark before dawn and reassembled the heart of the instrument by feel and lamplight, his hands and mine both shaking now, Naomi steadying the fine adjustment, and we turned it to the place in the sky, and it was there. A smudge of light with a tail of light behind it, faint and cold and absolutely, undeniably real, arriving exactly where a poor man on a mountain had said it would, on the day he'd said, in a ledger signed in his own hand with a disgraced grocer's daughter as his witness. Thomas Ballard put his eye to the glass and looked at the thing he'd predicted alone in the dark for years, and he did not make the sound. He was very quiet. He looked for a long time. And then he stepped back and made Naomi look, because, he said this, I heard it, because she had earned first sight of it as much as he had, and a scholar shares the sky. I looked last. I looked at a comet that no one back east knew was coming, found by a man the whole valley called poor, confirmed by a girl the whole valley called ruined, and I understood that I was one of exactly 3 people on the face of the earth who knew the truth at that moment. And I understood, too, that the truth was now safe. It was in the ledger. It was signed and dated and witnessed. When the astronomers back east finally spotted the comet weeks later and went scrambling to name it, there would be a record, mailed in triplicate to 3 separate journals the morning of the 9th. Naomi had seen to that, practical to the bone even in triumph. A record proving that a man named T. Ballard had numbered its return months before any of them, on a mountain in Arizona, with his own hand-ground glass. They could not scrub him out this time. There were too many witnesses, and the dates were on his side, and the girl had made sure of the mail. I won't tell you it ended in triumph, because that's not how it ended, and I promised you at the start I'd tell it true. The comet made Thomas Ballard's name modestly in the small world of men who read those journals, but truly and for good. Papers came. Letters came. An institution back east, embarrassed perhaps by the old theft it had let stand, offered him a position and a proper instrument and the recognition a decade late. And Thomas Ballard, who had wanted exactly that his whole ruined life, turned it down. He was tired. His hands were nearly gone, and he'd found up on that mountain something he'd stopped expecting, not vindication, but company. A person who saw what he saw. He said the sky was the same sky from Arizona as from anywhere, and better here, and that he'd rather finish his work on his own 40 acres with his own witness than be paraded back east as a curiosity by the very men who'd once erased him. So he stayed. He died the following spring. Quietly, of nothing dramatic, just an old heart at the end of a hard road, in the leaning cabin, with Naomi there. The railroad never did get the land. Naomi fought the Proots through 2 years of papers and won, because the comet had made Thomas just famous enough that ruining him quietly was no longer possible. And there is a bitter justice in that, that the same fame he didn't want for himself became the shield that protected his home. She buried him up there on the mountain where the sky was best. I helped dig it. It was the second grave I dug for a man I loved, and this time, I told you at the start, this time I wept, and I was not ashamed. There was a boy at the burying, near grown by then, 14 or so, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, the wheelwright's son, the one who used to ask about the moon, the one who'd said in the mercantile that Thomas was the only one who ever answered him. He'd walked up the mountain alone to be there. His father hadn't come and hadn't sent him. He'd come on his own, against everything he'd been taught, because a man who answered a boy's questions had died and the boy meant to see him into the ground. I watched Naomi notice him. I watched her go to him after and put something in his hands. I found out later it was a book, the same slim book on the movement of the stars that had started the whole thing, property of T. Ballard written inside in that spidery hand. She gave it to the boy. Return if found, though I doubt it shall be. It had been found. It had come all the way back around, and she was sending it out again, into another pair of hands the world was getting ready to waste. Naomi stayed on the mountain. I know that surprises some folks when I tell it. A young woman, her name cleared enough by then that she might have gone back down to some version of a respectable life, and she chose instead to keep a scholar's cabin on 40 acres of rock and grind glass and watch the sky. But you understand it, I think, if you followed me this far. She hadn't sacrificed her old life for Thomas, not really, and not for the comet either. She'd sacrificed it for the thing the comet stood for, the right to look through the glass herself and decide what was true, instead of taking the valley's word for it. She wasn't going to give that back now that she'd bled for it. She kept the ledger. She kept adding to it. Last I heard, and it's been some years, I'm an old man now and the letters come slower. She trained 2 students of her own, girls the world had been getting ready to throw away, and she taught them to grind glass and read the sky and price their own souls before letting anyone else do it for them. There's a small observatory up there now, they tell me, a real one, built stone by stone with money that trickled in from people who read the journals and understood what had happened on that mountain. They named it for him, Ballard, the poor man's name up in brass on a mountain under the best sky in the territory. I've read my log back 100 times, the pages soft as cloth now, the tear still there under the word nothing from that first rainy night. And I think what the whole thing taught me, an old hard cattle buyer who trusted a column of figures more than any living soul, is that the valley had it exactly backwards, top to bottom, the whole time. They pitied the richest man among them and envied the poorest. They threw away their only honest child and called it justice. They walked past the wonder every single day for 11 years because it wore patched trousers, and it took a girl with ink on her fingers, a girl they ruined for it, to climb the hill and see. I still don't fully understand it. I don't think I'm meant to. Some nights I take the log out and read that torn page and I sit a while in the quiet, and I think about a man in a creek in his stocking feet, laughing, and a girl in a doorway not begging, and a ring around a distant world that most of that valley went to their graves never knowing was even there to be seen. And I think they were the rich ones, all along, the 2 the town called poor and ruined. They were the only rich people I ever met. I just wasn't looking through the right glass to see it, and it cost me half my life to learn how.